Hey everyone, give you a little bit of a break from the lecture, obviously today, but I do want to cover this topic, Web API overview, which covers JSON, AJAX, and some example code, as I like to do. But before we begin, don't forget that there is a lab this week. I've given you a little bit more time, and I've also given you a little leeway on um, the due date for assignment 3. So check Blackboard for those updates. But don't forget to do lab 3 because obviously it's worth 10%. I know you have a lot going on, but yeah, just make sure you get it done. So as I said, this shouldn't take too long, but it is kind of an important lesson. And I guess it's kind of good to know in general because this JavaScript object notation really applies to every kind of app right now. So whether you're sending messages on WhatsApp, or Facebook or Instagram, or if you're downloading Snapchat or TikTok videos, all of this data is prefaced through JSON. So actually, um, JavaScript was basically invented in 1995, and it was by this guy that used to work at Netscape. So Netscape was like one of the large browsers back in the 90s, and I think JavaScript used to be called LiveScript, and it doesn't really matter. Anyway, uh, JavaScript object notation is effectively the object-oriented version of things for JavaScript, right? So we've seen this before. If I made var person, and if I put in first name and then last name, like we've all seen this kind of before. And if I do a console.log, oops, console.log person.first name, obviously first name will pop up on the bottom of the screen, and we can concatenate this, and we know all this because we've done this a bunch of times, right? So when this guy invented JavaScript, you know, there was this other thing called XML, which was used for sending data. So it's called extensible markup language. And XML kind of looks like, let's see if I can find a sample, something like this. And it looks like very similar to HTML, right? So markup language, and XML has there's lots of different attributes. You can see, this one has some IDs. It has a name of something, and it was at the time one of the best ways to send data back and forth. But the creator of JavaScript really took a cue from C++, C Sharp, all of these kind of languages, and made it object oriented. And parsing XML, taking this XML and parsing it into JavaScript was kind of a pain in the butt because you'd have to transfer, all of this over. And so effectively XML kind of got left behind, and it's still popular today. There's other ways of doing stuff, XML, YAML, and all this stuff, but JSON is pretty much the de facto kind of language. So now a lot of APIs, and we'll talk about APIs in a minute, just actually send JSON instead of XML. So why this is important is because a lot of data on the internet flies around with this JSON standard, and even things for let's see if I can find a crypto. I know I have one here. Here's a crypto API call, and if you look at this, it looks like an object, right? So this could be, I don't know, I guess a trade, and then here's like trade ID, price, quote volume, whatever. This would be like a person, first name, last name, whatever. This is in JSON. And now I have a plugin in my browser that actually formats this so it kind of looks like a tree. But check this out. If I turn the plugin off, you'll see that this is just effectively a string. And it's all in the same line. It's not formatted. And this is how data is sent. And again, all APIs work like this. They all send string data for the most part. So what we actually have to do is parse this data. So I'm just going to show you a quick example. So let's say I want to turn person, instead of this object, I'm just going to turn it into an actual string. And we'll do something like this. It is slightly different syntax, but bear with me. Looks like this. I think that should work. There you go. So this is just a regular string now. It's not an object. If I save this code, obviously we get undefined down here because there is no person object, right? So this could be called person JSON string, or we just call it person JSON. And we have built in, because this guy made this and he built it right into JavaScript, we can say, let's convert our JSON string into an object. So we parse it. So it's called JSON.parse, real easy. And we just take the person JSON, which again is just the string, and we parse it. Right, there's just one line of code. And as you can see, there we have our person object again. So effectively, if there's a way, which I'm going to show you shortly, on how to call APIs and put them into a string, I can now manipulate, objects inside of my program really easy, which is, very, very handy when you're writing apps or different websites. We can also go the other way. So let's say, for example, we would like to write an API, which we will want to do, and you have to do in assignment 3 effectively. And again, we'll talk about what APIs are in a moment. But let's say we go back to our original code. Right here. All right, so here's my person object. And here, I'll just put our old code above here, because I'll probably paste this into Discord later. All right, so here's our person object again. And now instead of doing console.log with the object, I actually want to just create a string that says, we'll just use the same one actually. Person JSON equals, and then we can do JSON.stringify. So we can stringify any object in this, and then we can console.log it. And if you notice, now down here I am putting out the output of the object in this line of code here, but we also put out the whole JSON string, which is right down here. And this works for anything, right? So relatively easy, JSON.parse, JSON.stringify. In other languages, this is typically known as serialization and deserialization. So serialization is basically refers to the process of converting this complex data into a string or something that it can easily be transmitted, right? Deserialization is obviously the reverse. So you probably hear that in other languages, but in this one it's parse and stringify. There are some caveats with this. So if your object has something like a date inside of it, you actually can't do things like this. Whatever. Better spell things right. It will run this function, but it will automatically kind of convert it into the date object itself. But it's not going to actually give you a new date inside of the object itself. So you notice that the string itself doesn't have this code in it. And that's because JSON is supposed to be universal. This new date function might not exist in other languages. The same will hold true for functions. So if you have a function inside of your JSON, or inside of your JSON object, only JavaScript really allows you to do that. So if you had something like this, whatever it is, it won't matter. It's not going to add it to the JSON because it's not valid inside of the rest of the world, kind of thing. So it's just some caveats you have to notice that it's not going to work on all things inside of JavaScript. So in the notes it talks about AJAX next, but I'm going to talk about APIs. So an API is application programming interface, and effectively this is what all of our apps, all of our programs, Discord, chatting, email, all of this stuff works on a thing called APIs. And this just gives us access to data in other, in other instances on the internet. Or even your video games will work on APIs. So there are a couple different ways APIs work, and there's multiple different ways, how to run them and all this stuff. But the most common one is something called REST or RESTful APIs. And this word REST comes from something called representational state transfer. Yeah, it's kind of weird, but it's basically the architecture of the internet. So I don't know how to describe this. Effectively, there's parameters or a blueprint of how to use something, and these REST APIs have that. So it's actually easier to show you an example than to describe it. So I'm going to use, for example, the crypto API that I've been playing around with, and the one that I actually grabbed this sample from. So if you check it out, this is a crypto website, an exchange or whatever, and they have APIs, and they have different versions of their APIs, right? So they might have released this V1 whenever, or V2, and they keep the old ones around, just because there's other apps that run them. But if you scroll through this, you can actually see, okay, if I want to get something called, I don't know, recent trades. So this would be the API call that you call, and then this is what is expected to be sent back. And it's basically how these all work. So Twitter, or now X, has one of these. Instagram has one, and then there's tons of websites. Basically, every website in the world has a kind of a hidden API. So sometimes when you're using an app that's not official, someone has back engineered their API and allowed you to use that. So they call these REST or RESTful. And then there's other types of APIs like WebSocket APIs, which we don't really learn in this course, but those are like more live kind of streaming APIs. So why do we care about this? Obviously, we want to get data. You know what? I'm going to just save this for later. I don't know, JSON example. And like I said, the entire internet app, your car, whatever, if it's hooked up to a computer, likely use an API if it connects. And we use this so we can do these things called CRUD operations. So CRUD stands for create, read, update, and delete. Right? It looks CRUD, create. Oops. Maybe I just copy and pasted it. Create, read, update, delete. And if we can program all of these things, create, read, update, delete, we can basically make any type of API, and effectively we can make any app and any kind of website. So if you can create a new user, register a user, if you can read that user information or create a new post and read that blog post, and you can update it or you can delete it, and or you have the ability to make the next Facebook, WordPress, Instagram, whatever it is that you want. So Express allows us to kind of do this a lot easier. So I'm just going to make it real simple. I guess I don't know if it's an API really. Well, yeah, let's actually, let's do it this way. I'm going to make a real simple Express server, right? So a simple one would be something like this. Right, so this should create a route. This is a route for API/users. So if I save this code, it says, we're listing now in port 80, and I'm sending a JSON object. There's our JSON object. In fact, let's make it a little bit more apparent to see. So I can do var, object equals this. And the cool thing about this object, actually, let's not call it object. Let's call it message. The cool thing about this message, or more importantly, this send function, if I actually do res.send and send a JSON object into it, it will automatically do the parsing for us, or stringify. So check this out. I'm going to open up the website that we just created, localhost 8080, and then it was API/users. And notice there's our JSON message, right? And again, this just comes as a string, but I have the plugin that kind of makes it look a little bit neater. So effectively, I created our first API just by using app.get and sending out an object. So inside of here, you can actually do a bunch of stuff. Let's say we read data from a database. Maybe this is user data, read user data from database, and then send that back to whatever the endpoint. Sorry. So yes, these are called routes. But in API land, we call these endpoints because it's kind of the end of whatever it is that we're doing. So you might hear that terminology interchanged, which is kind of cool. Not cool. It's kind of confusing. Now here's something even more confusing, and this applies to your assignment 3. So I'm going to actually just open up MS Paint here, or my favorite paint tool, JS Paint, I guess, JavaScript Paint. And I'm just going to draw out what's happening. So we have, our client, which is our browser, client browser. And over here we have our server, which is Express. And the weird thing kind of that's happening in assignment 3 is, and what I'm going to show you right here, is that right now in our Express server, we've coded the user API endpoint, or API user endpoint. And I'm not really doing anything until I actually open up localhost and go to that endpoint, right? Nothing's really happening. So my client browser is actually saying, hey, go to this endpoint. The server says, no problem, I'm going to send that data back, and we get it. That's pretty simple to understand. But here's where something weird happens in the assignment. So you might actually see, we might actually have a route for index, right? So here's index route. I called it home, but I'll change it to home, right? So now if I run my server and I go to home, oops, I'm going to put in the path constant. There we go. Right, and then we get our hello world, which is just in my HTML. When I do this, I'm serving a web page, but when I call API/users, I'm serving an API. So in the assignment, you'll notice that it kind of asks you to write a web page that also has these APIs involved in it. And this can be somewhat confusing, but the reason that we do stuff like this is because eventually maybe our website will not just be a website anymore, but it could also be a live API. So we can save ourselves a hassle. Like, say, for example, I do want to get all of the users' information, and I want to make a web page that also lets us, say, get that information displayed on the page nicely or edit it. We could make the API calls inside of our same website so that we are building the API at the same time. So now, for example, if I'll show you this fetch thing in a minute. But now, for example, if I run this home page, right, I'm going to ask the server first for a home page, and then the server's going to send it back, and then the home page might actually say, I want to run the API called users, get that data, send it back here, and then we'll display all of the data on the screen after that we already have loaded it. So this is kind of how our websites are going to work. You just got to remember that in reality, this server is usually somewhere different than, the web server is typically, I wouldn't say different, but it might be on a different domain name, whatever. We're just kind of doing it at the same time, which might get a little confusing. So I just wanted to show you that. But I'm going to show you an example once we talk about AJAX. Also, notice that, and I won't do full examples for these because you can get them on the Web322 site, but notice this is a GET. So if we wanted to send data from our web browser over to our server, we would do app.post. So what you're going to have to do eventually, because we're going to send data from our site into our web server and do stuff with it. But again, that's kind of an on your own situation. All right, so last thing, this was 18 minutes. We probably have a couple more minutes. So we have something called AJAX. And AJAX stands for Asynchronous JavaScript and XML. Sorry, I paused the video and lost track of what I was saying. AJAX. Right, so AJAX stands for Asynchronous JavaScript and XML. Now remember, XML used to be the primary thing that we transferred data across, or as, but now we use JSON. So the acronym, it's Asynchronous JavaScript and XML. It doesn't really stand for what it does now, but it kind of does. So anyway, asynchronous. This means you can do multiple things at once on anything, and more specifically on a web page or in computing. Like, for example, I can, I can have my Discord open, I can move it around, I can still talk, I can record this video, I can have a TV playing in the background, whatever. So these are all asynchronous tasks. If this asynchronous stuff didn't exist, we would actually have to wait for each task to finish before we can start a next task. So even like moving our mouse, they sometimes call this multi-threading when you have a multi-threaded processor and all this kind of stuff. So when you buy an actual processor and you're like, oh, I have the new I don't even know. Pentium. That's how dated I am. I have no idea what the processor. But when you have the newest, latest, greatest Intel chip or AMD chip, and they're like, we have multi-processor and this 18 processors. Well, sometimes that's better than just having a really super fast processor because you can't multitask as much. Anyway, so asynchronous, synchronous call. Asynchronous stands for multiple. Synchronous means we have to wait. So when you're on a web page and you're scrolling down, like, I don't know, Instagram. I don't know if I can actually look at Instagram if I'm not logged in. No, but I don't know, maybe CNN. So right as I scroll, maybe this is not an example, but when I hit the bottom of the page, what's going to happen is I can still, scroll around, but things are still loading. And, this is when we get that little spinner that says like loading screen, and we get more data. So these are asynchronous JavaScript calls. So one of the most important async JavaScript calls are the ability to actually get information from another place or another server. So before this new way of doing it, so I'm going to show you this new way, but there was an older way of doing it. And the older way is called XML response header. Actually, sorry, I think it's called XML HTTP request, and it used to look like this. So I'll just write the script here, and this is going to be somewhat pseudocode, but we would have the API or a URL for an API, right? So API URL equals, we'll use the one from our crypto example, right? So I'm going to use this, and then there was a var, I think it looked like this. And then we had to open the connection ourselves. Again, this is pseudocode. We had to say it was a get connection API URL, and I'm just doing this kind of from memory. And then we had this onload thing, and we had to do a bunch of stuff in here, do stuff. And it was real, and then we had to send the request, if I remember. Okay, so this was like a lot of steps. In fact, there were a lot of steps inside of this. But in ECMA 6, which is like the latest version of JavaScript, we are allowed to use this thing called fetch. And fetch looks like this. For a get response using fetch, it just looks exactly like this. So it's fetch, and then whatever the URL is, so we're going to drop in API URL like this, right? And this is an asynchronous call, so it goes and gets the data from the API. And then when it's done, it's going to send the response, or sorry, show us the response as JSON. And then when that's done, which is this one, it's going to do a console.log for us to our screen. So they usually put these on separate lines, so you can kind of see this. But if I've done this correctly and I save this website, so which is now home.html, so our server is now listening on 8080. And our server over here has this home route. And I'm going to go back to our web page, which is right here, and it's just hello world, right? So if I refresh the page, it just says hello world. But in the background, if I go to inspect, in fact, actually, I guess I can't do that. Hold on. We're going to come back to this problem. It says been locked by CORS, no access control, cross origin policy. I'll tell you about this later. It's not a big deal. But I'm actually going to change this API call. Same exact thing that we just did, but I'm going to call our localhost one. So localhost 8080, and then API/users. I think that's what it was, right? Yeah, users. And we'll use HTTPS or HTTP. Okay, so we'll go back here, refresh our page, and notice that I get inside of the console. I know it's tough. I can't zoom in on this one, but there is our output. There's message fetch all users, which didn't come from our web page, but it actually came from our API, which is right here, right? So I can change this to, hello from our server. And if I refresh the page, you can see there's hello spelled with 3 L's from our server. So remember, back to our paint. It's not this one from earlier today. Where did it go? Remember, back from our paint. So now our Express server has served our HTML over here, and then our HTML in a second request called our server and then sent back that data. Kind of cool. So this is how we would actually get data. And then if you remember from Web222, we can do stuff like document dot, get element by ID. So yeah, so get element by ID. Let's make it a var. I don't know, element users, and then I can do element dot inner HTML equals. Let's just try, test first, right? So we'll do a test. So just to make sure it works, it looks like it works. Here's our test function. So now we know that the fetch API works, and now we can put stuff inside of here. So we know that our JSON is actually an object, and we should be able to do JSON.message, hopefully, and you can see there is our hello from server, right? So it's kind of cool. I paused the video there, you may have noticed, because actually I moved this JavaScript around a little bit, but it doesn't matter right now. So you can see there's our hello from server. So again, this is kind of cool. So here's our API, our own API, localhost 8080 API/users. And I'm using the fetch command. And then inside of the fetch command, I'm saying, get our element called users, which is this div right here. And then set the inner HTML of that to our JSON object message. So, if we go back to here, and let's say instead of message, I'm actually saying person, and I want to do first name Harry, right? And then we send our whole person over here, and I go back to my HTML, and now I know that, JSON.firstName plus JSON.lastName. And if I refresh, you can see I now just consumed our API. Kind of cool, right? So again, you can do this with, now you can write your own API, you can connect it to a DB, which we'll learn later, but kind of cool stuff. Anyway, have a great rest of your week. Good luck on your midterms. That is all for today.